Paul, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have
Hi.
a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Okay, I am a retired academic from the field of computer science, before which I was an economist and then moved into computer science. I've worked on a variety of types of hardware design, 3D TV, compilers, databases, and have written a number of books on how computer technology can be used to plan a non-monetary economy.
Cool. Could you tell me a little bit about that? How exactly could we have a non-monetary society? Like, money seems to work really well for things. What would be the benefit of a non-monetary society?
Well, the classical economists like Adam Smith said that the real value of any product is the time and labor that human beings have to expend to obtain it. That is he referred to that as the real value, and money is just the nominal value of the thing. And other economists refer to money as a veil, which hides the real relations which take place in the economy. So the real constraint on what you can produce in a society is set by its labor force and the number of hours they can work for. So if you see a society that is faced with a declining labor force, like Japan, where the number of people falls year on year because the birth rate is low, under those circumstances, it's impossible for a capitalist monetary economy to work smoothly. What you get is a chronic low rate of profit in industry. This is expressed by the state bank then has to lower the rate of return on interest to around 0%. And even so, the economy stagnates. That's because basically the rate of profit in a capitalist economy is bounded by the rate of growth of the labor force. And as the rate of growth of the labor force becomes negative, the equilibrium rate of profit of a capitalist economy tends to become negative as well, and the economy goes into stagnation.
Is that not the same for all economies, that is dependent on the amount of workforce you have, and as the workforce dwindles?
That's true. In any economy that there is, you can't, you'll run into problems if you have a declining workforce. The problem, but you could in principle run an economy perfectly effectively at a replacement population level, where you weren't increasing or decreasing. But if you have a capitalist economy under those circumstances, you find that the equilibrium profit rate is zero. And you therefore would have to run the economy in a different way, in which the seeking for profit was not the objective. And the objective has to be to allocate resources to meet needs in the most efficient way possible. And that most efficient way possible has to come down to the greatest economy of labor that you can achieve, because at that point, your labor force becomes the constraining factor. You don't have any more people. And to maintain an adequate standard of living, that labor force has to be used as effectively as possible. Now, one of the things which stops that happening in a country like the United States, or Britain for that matter, is that for decades now, real wages have stagnated or actually fallen. And this means that the cost, apparent cost to firms of labor, is artificially low. It's very low. Because the share of the product that goes to workers has been declining in the United States since the time of Richard Nixon. Now, that means that it doesn't pay a capitalist firm to employ the most modern technology. It's much cheaper to waste labor using old-fashioned techniques and manual labor techniques to produce things. So that you see, for example, we've had in the last 15, 20 years, a reversion to early 20th, late 19th century techniques. Have you seen Deliveroo riders? People who, well, you get them in Britain. They are people who deliver things, either documents or food or groceries, etc., on bicycles.
Oh yeah, we have that in New York, a few of those.
Okay, maybe it's not called Deliveroo. You get the appearance of rickshaws in Western cities. These are things which at one time only occurred in China, where labor was dirt cheap and inefficient methods of doing things that were labor intensive could be sustained. All that happens because labor is undervalued. And technological development comes to a halt when that happens. I'll tell you a story about IBM. In the 1960s, IBM transformed the computer industry by introducing the IBM 360 series, which is where the term byte came from. It was the first byte address computer, and it was the first computer with a standard architecture that they could offer a whole range of machines in it. And it was a huge runaway success for IBM. From being just one manufacturer among many, they came to completely dominate the computer business. And a lot of basic things we take for granted now came from the fact that there are credit cards, for example. That became possible because of the mass production of these IBM mainframes, which could be used for credit card payment and the banks to automate their activities. Now, in order to do that in those days, they had to rely on what was known as magnetic core memory. They didn't have RAM chips as we have now. They had, they had very small little loops of magnetite, which had to have wires threaded through them. Now, in the 1960s, IBM was a very progressive, advanced company, and they found they're having to build more and more factories to make these core memories to keep up with the huge demand for mainframe computers. And they even went and opened a factory to make robot machines that would make the core memories. Okay? And then one of their executives came back from the Far East and said, "This is a terrible waste of money. I can hire women in Thailand to thread wires through these by hand for less cost than the building them by machines and having it done in America." So that's what they did. They offshored the production to Thailand and had the things put together by basically craft industry techniques because wages were so low. Now, how do you get around that? You get around that by costing actual costs of production in hours. If you cost everything in hours, the illusions that firms have that it's efficient to use a lot of labor and a small amount of machinery get removed, because the machinery and the labor are paid for on an equal basis. At present, if a firm purchases machinery, it pays for it at its full value. If it can hire labor at half or a quarter its full value, labor is undervalued, machinery is expensive, it attempts to use more labor, and the rate of technological progress slows down. And you can see that. The rate of
So
technological progress is much lower now.
question, when
than
you
it-
say price things at the hours of value, does that mean like set the
okay,
price of the
in
product
in in
relative to the
any
hours it takes to build it?
in any economy, things take a certain number of hours to be made. Okay, and the wage that a person receives can also be converted into hours, because you convert it into hours by seeing how many hours labor went into the goods that a person receives. And that's the only real way you can compare living standards at different points in time. Okay? You can't really compare living standards in the 1950s with living standards now in terms of dollars, because the dollar wages were very low. But that doesn't actually represent the reality. You have to say, how many hours did it take to make a standard Chevrolet that an American family would have had in 1958? How many hours does it take to make, I don't know, what's the standard large car an American would have now? Compare the
Toyota.
number of hours of labor that goes into them. Okay? That's the value of those, the real value to society of those two cars. Then you see how many hours did someone have to work to get that car? How many hours do they have to work to get the car now? Now, what you find is that to get the same thing, in many cases, people now have to work longer. And that's a result of two things happening. One is the slowdown in technical progress, and the other is the fact the share of national income going to labour has shrunk. It's been going down year by year by year. The share of national income going into labour has gone down, and the share of national income going to property owners has gone up. And this slows down technical progress. It slows down labour-saving inventions, and it results in a deteriorating standard of living for the majority of the population. Now,
How does it slow down technological innovation? Because it seems like most of that comes from like research and development of large companies and colleges.
research and development is done, but when does it pay to actually employ it? To employ it, you have to carry out capital investment. You have to modernize and extend the capital stock. Now, if you look at a country like the United States, its capital stock is in a decayed state. Both the fixed capital stock for infrastructure, also the productive capital stock. What is the United States' current capacity to produce ships, for example?
Pretty low compared to other countries. I think we produce
Pretty
very
low,
little ships.
because the investment in docks and in shipyards has been allowed to run down. Now, even if you take high-tech things like chip production, what capacity do the United States now have to produce chips?
Very low. I think most of them come from South Korea.
They come from Taiwan, South Korea, and generally the Far East, because those countries have invested in new productive facilities. If you were to go back 30 years, there would be no doubt the United States had plenty of industrial capacity of that sort. But a prolonged period of low wages discourages capital investment of that sort. Capitalists only invest if they think that it's going to be cheaper than employing people at low wages. Now, to get around that, you have to pay people an hour for an hour. So if I work an hour, I can get goods which took an hour to be made.
How would you do that? How would you?
That's the basic principle. You'd have to do it in two stages. First, you'd have to pass a law outlawing the exploitation of workers, in the same way that Lincoln passed a law outlawing the exploitation of slaves. You have to say that in any company, the proprietorial rights to value added in production belong to those who work in the company. And therefore, the full value added is the property of those who work in the company.
What about things that are like good
That
versus
would,
bad products? Like if
sorry?
so like if someone spends an hour to make a meal and another person spends an hour to make a meal, Gordon Ramsay making a meal is going to be significantly better than mine, but they both took an hour to make. So the value for those seems to be disproportionate, even though the amount of time it took was equivalent.
These things, you cannot expect in an economy where things are still being sold for you to impose the time of one person is identical to the time of another. That's just unrealistic, as you say. Different people have different skills. On the other hand, when you're dealing not with individual stars like that, but you're dealing with large companies, a company like Boeing that employs tens of thousands of people, the actual difference in skills there becomes negligible because you get regression to the mean. It becomes just a certain number of man hours. Some of the man hours are better, some of the man hours are worse. But when you take an average of 100,000, 10,000, regression to the mean means that the deviation is negligible. So that for large companies, it essentially means that the value they add correlates extremely highly with the labor employed. For instance, it's difficult to get statistics for this for the US directly because the Bureau of Economic Affairs doesn't publish detailed hours worked for every industry in its IO tables. The Swedes do, for example, and the Germans do. And if you take the Swedish statistics, you find that the correlation between value added in an industry, or the value of output of an industry, and the integrated labor time devoted to the product is around 97, 98%. You get a small amount of variation still because some industries might require higher than average skills, but it's very small once you're talking about the level of the economy as a whole. Now, that is still just a first stage. You would overprint the dollar, for example, to say that it was worth 2 minutes. Well, I may be wrong. A dollar may actually be worth, in the US, is probably about 1.5 minutes. When you pay a dollar for something, it has on average required about 1.5 minutes work to make. So you could overprint the currency with time, but that still only operates at the level of averages. And you still have the randomness which inevitably occurs in any commodity economy. Okay, there are people who work on econophysics. There's this guy called Yakovenko who wrote a very interesting paper called The Statistical Mechanics of Money, where he shows that you can predict the variation in income in a monetary economy using the same laws as he, as a physicist, uses to study the energy of gases. And it follows something known as a Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution. And it inevitably means that some people get more and some get less. This is the thing you're saying about Alan Ramsey. If you have a certain number of small traders, small businesses, some will do better, some will do worse, just by chance, through the multiplicity of different effects which operate. So if you actually have a monetary economy, even if you initially set everything up in a situation of equilibrium or equal distribution of income and wealth, it rapidly polarizes, initially due to the random effects of the Gibbs-Boltzmann distribution. And then something else comes in. As soon as people can lend money at interest, okay, you then get a polarization of wealth which becomes much more extreme, because it's a self-perpetuating process. Those with more money accumulate money faster and faster because of interest. So that you would have to get rid of any kind of payment of interest, and you'd have to make laws on rents such that, for example, rents couldn't exceed what is required to repair and maintain and replace a building. You'd have to eliminate these forms of rent income which distort the whole economy, and move to a system where you calculate things in terms of time, and you pay people in terms of time.
So what about things like iPhones, for example, something that has, or PlayStation 5. So a PlayStation 5 takes
Yeah.
about 2 hours to make in a factory, but the demand for it is significantly higher than the supply. Would you still
Yes.
have to charge relatively low even though the demand is super high?
No, you can't. If you have mismatches between supply and demand, you have to allow for that. Suppose we mark everything in the supermarkets with their true value. How many hours did it take to make a PlayStation 5? If through some shortage, like a chip factory burns down in Taiwan, although it takes 2 hours to make a PlayStation 5, you can't do it because the chip factory isn't working. At that point, if you tried to hold the price at 2 hours, it would sell out completely and be shortages. So the retail sector of the economy has to be instructed to break even. If some things are in excess demand for that reason, they should be marked as a true value of 2 hours, but due to shortages, we're marking this up to 3 hours, and to compensate, we're offering discounts on other products.
And I'm assuming this
So
includes the cost of the materials, right? So certain
it
materials
has to
cost
include
more.
the cost of materials. Yes,
And what about
you have to set up a online public computerized system which lists the number of hours that were spent to make everything, and therefore it can be computed how many hours went indirectly into making the thing. Now, one of the things that I've been concerned to show is that actually the calculations required to do that are actually very tractable with modern technology. You can do it for you can do these calculations for the whole economy with a modern computer cluster in a few minutes. Processing power has come on so much that type of calculation is very easy to do.
Well, does that include like research and development time and trying different models?
Research and development. How should a society do research and development? You point out most of the real advances come from research that was done in universities or come from basic scientific research. Now, that has to be met out of taxation. That has to be met out of public expenditure. And people should be allowed to, when I say everyone should be paid in hours, if everyone in Boeing works a 40-hour week, they should all get 40 hours credited to them, but that doesn't mean that they don't pay income tax. And at Glasgow University, before I retired, we worked on a system for allowing people to vote using mobile phones on both what the level of taxation should be and what should be spent on the main tax headings. And to do this in a secure way, which was open and public, so you could check that there was no fraud taking place in the voting, and in a way which avoided the problem they have in California, for example, where the people can vote on tax levels, but they can't vote on expenditure headings. And that tends to introduce a deflationary bias into the system, because people will tend to vote to reduce taxes, but they have no way of voting to increase expenditure on schools or increase expenditure on hospitals or what have you. So to have a system that is fair, people have to be able to vote on both. The public has to be able to vote on both.
What about something like pasta? There's a pasta company who invests thousands of hours researching different recipes of pasta, and they come up with one that works really, really well. And it takes no time to produce this, but do you include all of the time they took in researching the different things and the trial and error in the cost of the pasta for each individual sale?
Well, it depends how society decides to fund it. If you decide to fund food research and food industry, then okay, you include all research done in the food industry as part of the cost of your food. Alternatively, you may decide that that's the business of the Department of Agriculture to fund that, along with how to improve the growth of durum wheat, and it would then come out of a budget line to do with agriculture. But I mean, these are political decisions. They're decisions that people have to take democratically. Where do you want that charged?
Is there a way to implement the system on a local level, like on a business level? Say one business wanted to try this system in a capitalist market. Would that be possible?
Well, yes, in a sense, because we know that firms based on the idea that all the value produced goes to the producers can exist and can coexist in the capitalist market. In Britain, one of the biggest supermarket and retail chains operates on that basis. It's called John Lewis or Waitrose. And back in the 1920s or 30s, it was converted into a worker-owned business.
Co-op?
It's essentially a co-op, yes. And it's highly successful.
So essentially that's what you're advocating for, is a kind of a co-op system?
It's a kind of a co-op system, but integrated so that you cease doing your calculations in terms of money, which is something that's necessary if it's a capitalist system, and you do the calculations in terms of time. And it's not a new idea. It was originally proposed by Robert Owen, the founder of the cooperative movement.
And how would you allocate resources? Wouldn't you still have to use some kind of a money-based system to say you worked X number of hours and that's your amount of resources you have?
Well, each business would have to be given a labor budget that it can employ. Let's assume that it's easier to see in a country like Britain where medicine is socialized, but each city has a number of hospitals, and it would have a labor budget for the number of people it's allowed to employ in those hospitals, and the indirect labor budget for the drugs and other materials that it uses. It couldn't, the hospital workers in Bolton couldn't themselves decide, oh, okay, we're going to increase employment in the Bolton hospitals to double the number of doctors and nurses, because there are only a certain number of doctors and nurses in the country. So that those sort of budgets, manpower budgets, would have to be set as the means by which the health service was paid for.
So if I wanted to say I'm a greedy, selfish person, I want to try and accumulate as much hour wealth as possible. How would I try to game the system to get more? How would
Well,
I, if I wanted to start a
once
business?
once you shift to time, it's very difficult for someone to game the system, because I don't know if you're familiar with how the state does budgeting, how governments do budgeting.
Drunken squirrels running in wheels
The
somewhere.
point is they don't have money, doesn't carry over. Okay, you've got to meet this year's expenditure out of this year's budget. If the Department of Defense has a surplus this year in America, it can't spend it next year. Okay, this is almost universal across states. And if you shift to that kind of system, that your budget for expenditure has to be spent within a year, then you can't accumulate money and exploit anyone else.
But then why would anyone start a business? Because isn't the whole point of starting businesses, I
Well,
want money?
why you wouldn't be able to do that? Because you wouldn't be able to exploit anyone else. On the other hand, a group of people could get together and say, we want to form a cooperative to better provide, I don't know, we have an idea for how to launch satellites more cheaply. And we're a group of engineers who thought this up. You've then got to present your case to some public body which is responsible for allocating resources and says, can we bid for a share of the US space budget, which is, let's say, 500,000 person years? Can we have 30,000 of those person years to build this new launcher?
Wouldn't that
But
lead to that seems like it would lead to a significantly less number of companies being made and a significantly less diversity of kinds of companies, because the incentive of greed motivates people to start companies, many of which are unsuccessful, but occasionally some very successful ones pop up simply by sheer chance. And that method seems to be very successful at driving economic growth, in that it creates a lot more businesses and therefore a lot more that grow and provide services. Whereas the model you're proposing seems like it would limit substantially the amount of people who are trying to start businesses.
There aren't large numbers of people designing new rocket launchers. There's Musk, there's SpaceX, and Blue Yonder. There's a small number of people who are capable of doing that.
Right, but your system, just to clarify, so your system would also apply to hairdressers, salons, toe and nail clippers, shoe shiners.
Yeah, but no great innovations have occurred in hairdressing for the last 50 years, have they?
Right, but my question is, if they want to start a company as a hairdresser, the reason they would want to do that is to try to make money. They think they have an idea which may or may not be revolutionary in hairdressing. But if your system was implemented, they would not have a way to make a significant amount of profit. And so their incentive for starting all of these various kinds of companies seems to go away. And so it seems like we would lose all of those smaller companies that have a very significant impact on the economy. Hairdressers, stylists, salons, all of these things are generate billions of dollars in GDP, and we would lose that.
No,
under your system.
If you want to be a hairdresser, you can get an hour for an hour doing hairdressing.
But the reason I want to be a hairdresser is to make money.
Once everything is in terms of hours, if you're going for a hairdresser, and the hairdresser spends 5 minutes on you and charges you 30 minutes, there's something odd going there, isn't there?
But when people want to start a hair salon, the reason they want to do it is because they want that disparity between more hours gained than hours worked. And so if they don't have that ability,
people want to set up a hair salon now, because if you are a self-employed person in a hairdressing business or some similar trade, You don't become rich, but at least you're not exploited. You're self-employed, and it's one way which in a current economy you can get an hour for an hour's labor. Whereas if you're some poor Joe working for a large company like McDonald's, you don't. So the point about that is they are aiming for getting a fair day's pay for a fair day's labor, which most people can't get. And what I'm saying is you should ensure that applies across the whole economy, so everyone gets what the hairdresser gets at the moment.
But that seems to go against human nature, because if we look at like casinos, people will spend more time going to the casinos that have the largest payouts but the least chance of winning than they do the lower payouts with the higher chance of winning. So like if someone wants,
why should gambling be legal?
Because it motivates people to take action. So like in the case of the analogy between gambling in a casino versus gambling in an economy, when someone starts a business, it's a gamble. They are investing a certain amount of money in hopes of gaining a larger return. And that hope motivates people to start businesses. That's why we have so many people starting businesses every day all across the world. It's because they want to be the millionaire. They want to be the Bill Gates, the Elon Musk, who just makes billions off of their company. That incentive, that hope of winning the jackpot, causes people to start numerous businesses, which develop sometimes very slowly, but the reason they started the business in the first place, what motivated them, wasn't that they wanted a fair day's wage. It was that they wanted the jackpot. And so even though most of them were delusional and they're not going to get the jackpot, the effect that they have is building the economy in such a way that there are millions of businesses, and they try different things in an evolutionary standpoint where the ones that are successful grow. And that seems to be, if we adopted your system, we would lose that very integral aspect.
What you've admitted yourself, that this is all an illusion, that people don't become billionaires. What the vast majority of them can hope for at best is to get an income. In the US, it would be maybe, if they're doing well, $40 an hour. Okay, they don't become millionaires. That they do better than someone who is a wage worker. But even the competition to set up small businesses tends to drive down the earnings even of those in small businesses. So that although ideally, since there's no one exploiting them, they should be able to make $40 an hour, but the over-competition and excess numbers of people moving into these trades mean that many of them barely make anything. So it's not an efficient way of using resources. I'm reaching the my time slot now. Okay, and my dog's needing a walk.
Sure. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. Would you like to give people a link or reference to where they can find your work?
Yeah. I have a YouTube channel with my own name, Paul Cockshott. That's probably the quickest way to look at what I say.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I will let you go.
Okay. Bye for now.